All right, thank you. I'm actually glad it's a small group. We're going to be able to do some interactive stuff that we were saving for the workshop, so you all are going to get to dive in a little bit deeper. First, we also want to say that we're grateful to be on Cheyenne and Arapaho land. And we also want to say that we're going to kind of dig into science a little bit and maybe even poke fun at some of its blind spots. But it's coming from a place of being people who work a lot with the sciences, and that, you know, both of our jobs are totally dependent on science, and some of the community work that I do is based on the work of science. So this isn't just coming from an outside critiquing perspective. This is people who engage with this all the time, and we just want to start looking at what are some of the blind spots that science has as a culture. Does that sound good?
Can you hear her in the back?
Yeah? Well, maybe before we get in.
Because we have that one too. That one's for the room.
Are you having a hard time hearing me right now? I think we're going to get you all up and out and back in anyway, and when we come back in, maybe we can come a little closer, and that would be helpful.
We won't bite.
No.
I won't get you sick. I hope.
So maybe before we do that, we'd like to get your all's input about what is the role, especially even if you think about the work that you're doing, what's the role of science? What are some of the goals? What are some of your goals? Why do we have this thing called science? And you all are going to have to participate because it's a small group. So
You could just shout out.
So what are the goals of science?
To benefit society, better medicine, or better technology.
Benefit society.
Everything.
Safer everything. Benefit society. Better medicine.
Satisfy human curiosity.
Ooh. Maybe we should have two going.
Understand the world around us.
Uh-huh. Understand the world around us.
Yep.
Yeah. Improve medicine. Informed decision making. Guiding policy.
Answering questions
Uh-huh. Answering questions. What questions?
that we have about the world. And we might think something is true, but we need the data to support that.
Uh-huh.
So,
As our whole world or a particular part of the world?
well, I mean, whatever it, research really focuses in on an individual, a specific topic. So there might be a question about that specific topic that could be answered.
Uh-huh. And so also it sounds like test hypotheses,
Yeah.
test our beliefs and questions. Anything else?
Make money off of the new technology.
Make money?
Concept.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things that we had.
Yeah, that was getting to some of it.
Conservation.
Conservation, probably like wildlife, water, energy. How many of you are working on conservation? Actually, I'm curious. Okay.
I was going to say, is it okay to be cynical about
Yeah, that's what our workshop.
develop its country's military?
Yeah, to develop weaponry. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk again about that in a little bit. Culture. And the culture of science. I studied anthropology in college, and after reading so many different things and hearing so many definitions of culture, my favorite definition is that culture is a set of beliefs, ideals, and behaviors that a group of people hold that they think are natural. And a lot of times when both of us, I think, do our work and we ask people about culture, they'll be like, oh, it's just normal. I actually did this recently with a group of people, and I was like, what music do you all listen to? And they're like, just the normal stuff. I'm like, well, okay, tell me what is normal in your group. So we're going to ask you, and Heidi, I don't know if you want me to write or if you want to write. What are some, in your experience, what is the language of science? Can you give us some terms that you hear in science? The way that people in the scientific community speak? Jargon? Like acronyms? I put acronyms on there. What's that? Discipline specific.
Evidence-based.
Evidence-based. That's actually the way they speak and the term that they use. So if we said we did this exercise and people were walking towards each other and they knew when to stop and when not to stop, where's your evidence? Okay, so evidence-based. What else? Is it reproducible? That's actually incredibly important. Is it reproducible? You had one?
I was just gonna say that very concise. This definition can vary. It's more of like I should say, field specific. So you kind of have to define your terms every time you're using them.
Very concise, which I think gets to the acronyms too. Just like okay. What about, who are some of the heroes and sheroes of this culture?
Nobel laureates?
Educated, but educated.
Highly educated people?
Quote-unquote discoverers.
Discoverers? Yeah, it's good to be the first person.
Please laureates.
Oh, just put Nobel.
Maybe it's changing, but there, like, traditionally has been a large emphasis on the kind of like one person show kind of idea of science.
Yeah.
And I like to think that it's changing to be more collaborative, but it's definitely the image that a lot of people have before maybe they go into it. It's person who does all of this brilliant stuff on their own.
So the one hero or one heroine, I think that's really important, especially if we're going to talk, which we will a little bit at the end, of how to collaborate with communities. That's really important. What about the concept of elders? How does eldership work in the scientific community? Mentorship? Tenure? Advisor to advisor to advisor. What about, are there things that you want to do that you should ask your elders for permission for in this culture?
Spending money.
What's that?
Spending money.
Spending money. You have to ask your elders about spending money.
Submitting a publication.
Submitting a publication.
The kind of research you can do oftentimes.
The kind of research you can do. Okay.
Yeah, you have to do what they're interested in as well.
But even more generally, like the elders of the elders, like there are review boards out there that whose entire purpose is to tell you this is what is allowed and this is what not is
Oh,
allowed.
so you have elder councils in your culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Elder councils.
They control publication too.
I'm going to skip some of these. Gender roles. Have there been gender roles in the culture of science?
Past, in that there was one gender with the role of science in many fields.
Yeah.
Would women have played a role in science, but it's always been an assisting role?
Women have played a role in science, unless it's an assisting role, even when it hasn't been an assisting role. That's how it's been seen.
I think even today there are gender roles that are unspoken. You notice like women scientists taking on roles that, although they are also taken on by men, they're maybe more likely to serve on certain committees or to do certain things. That it's not necessarily a hardcore like you can't like super established role, but it is something you do see gender disproportion.
It's unspoken, but if we wanted to do social science research, we could probably find very big differences in gender roles in science.
There's specific areas of science that are still today much more male than other areas. Some areas it's been easier for women to break into, but other areas have been difficult for women to break into.
That's right. So life sciences, there's almost parity with women and men, but engineering, physics, chemistry, there's nowhere near parity. Yeah. Let's see. In this community, how comfortable is science With ambiguity and uncertainty.
Very.
Huh?
My peers seem very, happy about it. Oh, well, we just don't know.
Okay.
Very within limits, I would say.
Very, but within
It's
limits.
exciting when you can figure out the limits of what you don't know. It's
Uh-huh.
very technological.
So they want to know the limits of what they don't know. Okay.
It's okay to be uncertain, but it's not, it in certain things, but then like you can't, you can only, for example, like facts, like that is something that is like an important idea, like what we know and what we don't know, and distinguishing between those two things is important. But it's okay to have things you don't know.
You just have to name it.
Yeah.
That's
I think
good.
sometimes we try to define how much uncertainty there is. You see error bars all the time.
We're really obsessed with defining uncertainty.
Uh-huh. Do you feel like the scientific culture is task or relationship oriented? Task oriented. What are some of the?
Yeah, that's.
It's a binary.
Yeah, I mean, like, and mentorship and all of that, that's very relationship oriented, but maybe we want to think that it's all task oriented.
I mean, science isn't really transactional in that sense. I kind of see it as relationship oriented.
You see it as relationship oriented? Because you're in the communications group of science. That makes sense, but actually, we put up here binaries. A lot of these are binaries,
Yeah.
and if you get deep enough into any culture, you have variation, even if there's an overarching theme. So even though we said the field is kind of male dominated, if you look around the room, you wouldn't think that was true.
I would say it was not so relationship oriented, because if you look at the science, or I'm obviously a scientist because I go straight to the science, but if you look at the science around mental health for PhD students or graduate students, and even tenure track professors, you see that there's an increase in mental health issues as they go down that or go up that track, whichever way you see it,
Yeah.
because they're becoming more isolated.
Yeah.
And the stress. So for me, it seems less of a relationship-oriented field.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of outsiders' perspective of science, is that it is like that. And that actually leads us to, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, what are some of the rites of passage and rituals and ceremonies of science? So it sounds like you've kind of already named one, like you have to go through an ordeal and your mental health might suffer. That's part of the definition of a rite of passage. What are some of your other rites of passage and rituals and ceremonies?
Getting a first author paper, at least I'm in chemistry, so like that's a pretty big deal.
First authored paper.
Publishing and also earning grant money.
Publishing, earning grant money. So can I earn grant money if I was like, I want to do science?
So yeah, it's also very tied to your position in the society, because like only certain people are allowed to be PIs often.
How do I get to that position?
Get the PhD first, I guess. There's a good one.
A
Uh-huh.
whole series of rituals
Yeah.
on the way to getting your PhD.
Can you give me just...
Getting into graduate school.
Your defense, your perspective, all that stuff.
Passing your oral exam,
Uh-huh.
getting your PhD.
You probably need a bachelor's degree or some really good experience that they find relevant to get into the PhD program in the first place.
Uh-huh. And are there special clothing and things that you wear?
Yeah, elbow pads.
It's actually very interesting about the clothing, because I think that that's very discipline specific.
Mhm.
And like I'm an ecologist, but I'm actually wearing this on purpose because I like to walk around in non-field clothes when I'm not in the field. It's a bit of a statement that I'm allowed to do that.
Uh-huh.
But I think that it can be actually really interesting how those rules get enforced.
And if you were participating in one of these rites of passage and rituals, would you be able to do that?
those are actually exceptions to the rule about field clothing, I think.
Okay. Okay. So we're somehow taking up all the time. We're going to have to just scooch ahead a little bit. But we're just starting to get to, there's definitely a culture in this field. And also that often it's easier to see a culture from the outside. It's easier to come from the outside and know what's not normal and what is normal. So we're playing with that a little bit. This first quote, I'm going to reread it to you all. This is Freeman Dyson, who's well known for being only about rationality and facts, and that's what science is, and there's nothing else to it. So I'm going to reread this quote because when I read this quote, this is how I hear it. The vision of Christianity is not specifically Western. It's no more Western than it's Arab or Indian or Chinese. One of the central facts about Christianity is that it pays no attention to East and West and North and South and black and yellow and white. It belongs to everybody who's willing to make the effort to learn it and accept it into their hearts. So coming from outside of this worldview that he has, to me it sounds a lot like proselytizing that I've heard.
It's funny you say that because you replace science with Christianity both times.
Yeah.
On purpose.
Okay, on purpose, all right.
Yeah, so I'm keeping his quote as it is on the board, but I'm saying it as just as a way to start seeing this might actually be more than a set of facts. It might be a worldview. And the way that he's using it is kind of using the language that the worldview of Christianity uses often, which is funny because that's what he's trying to break away from. So he probably would hate me doing that. My apologies. Do you want to get into any of it? Let me give you this one.
No, I'm good. I
Okay.
have a cough coming on.
Okay. Well, so we'll quickly go through the next few, and that will let Heidi get to some of the mini case studies. We also like this quote that Vandana Shiva uses in one of her books by Sandra Harding, that the project that science's sacredness makes taboo is the examination of science in just the way as any other institution or set of social practices can be examined. So there is, even within the field of science, this sort of sacredness, and there's a taboo against turning in and looking too much at it, even though there are scientists that do that. This is an interesting thing because we usually separate spirituality and religion and science, but some of the language of it and some of the areas of what is taboo and what are not could, from the outside, seem like a cosmological framework.
There's an interesting relationship, in the idea of scientific revolution, and there's this mythology that it's the best facts and the best theory, then it proven out when there's all kinds of history that that's not necessarily the case. And then just like with Christianity and the earth not being the center of the universe, like there are these big seismic shifts that take all of this time and all of this resistance and all of this politicking to get those scientific theories to shift, right? And
Yeah.
but there's this mythology that it's the best theory that wins.
Uh-huh. And the newest one is also the best. Have any of you encountered any of this in your research, that you see that there's something that's questionable, but politically it would not make sense to point it out in your field? It's okay if not. In the anthropology field, it happens a lot. I'm going to give you a couple more quotes. Science is one thing, wisdom is another. Science is an edged tool with which men play like children and cut their own fingers. So also from the outside, there's a lot of cultures, Heidi and I were talking about, there's a lot of cultures where you're not allowed to learn certain things until you're a certain age. Right? And Kabbalah, a Jewish mystery school, you're not allowed to learn it until you're 40 or over. Which when you're younger, you're like, what the heck? Especially if you're coming from this culture, you're like, what the heck is that? It's knowledge, it should be available to everyone. But when I think about things like atomic energy or even genetic engineering and modification, it starts to seem to make sense. Like maybe there is knowledge that until you're at a certain stage of development, maybe you shouldn't have access to. I'm just putting that out there. And Heidi's a big Star Wars fan. And Dexter Jetster gets to this too, and he says, Obi-Wan Kenobi comes to him to help him figure out this thing, and he had all his droids go through this information. They couldn't figure it out, and so he comes to this guy, and he says, it's these funny little cuts on the side that give it away. Those analysis droids only focus on symbols. I should think that you Jedi would have more respect for the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So we're just gonna breeze through some of this stuff. I'm sorry if we're throwing too much at you. But like all things, science is intertwined with all of these other things, and we already started speaking about a lot of scientific research being developed for wartime and for warfare. And in the 80s, which is when I had an old statistic from, in the 80s, 80% of scientific research was devoted to warfare. And then there's been a lot of people who've pointed out this pattern in science that things get developed for warfare, and then business and industry and corporations take it over and try to find peacetime uses for it before it becomes a public use or commodity. The internet is such a case. A lot of the pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers that we use are cases of this. Even things like I just mentioned, like genetic modification. A lot of this stuff is being developed for wartime purposes and being funded by research that's looking at how do we improve our warfare? How do we improve battling and destroying things? And then that gets taken over and being looked at as, well, maybe there's a good way we can use this too. And there's some really interesting stuff with that. You can look at Edward Teller's work and whatnot, but I think that part of this is to start asking the question of who's involved, what's the purpose, what are the politics, and what are the larger ideological frames, and where's the culture? And so we just put these just four to touch on, because science does not exist in a vacuum, right? A lot of the funding is coming from business or the government. Are you all seeing that in your research here? And often community is just left out of this picture, so we thought it would be important to put that back in. But it kind of puts researchers in a tenuous place, because sometimes you're being funded by people who want certain answers that you may or may not be getting in your research. It's actually causing a crisis in the scientific world, which we can get to in a little bit. I think first we should let you.
Okay, now I get to talk, and hopefully I won't cough. So when Michelle and I were thinking about this, my background is in indigenous knowledge. That's what Aloka is about. And so indigenous knowledge is, unlike science, everything is connected, and I'm hoping that you guys might realize this already. And I wanted to share with you how indigenous knowledge and how science can work together, and then you can make up your own determination, as I have, on how indigenous knowledge is viewed by Western science. So in 1977, the International Whaling Commission imposed a ban on the harvest of bowhead whales in Alaska. Seeing this as a crisis situation, the indigenous Alaskans formed their own commission, composed of one representative of each bowhead hunting community, to help fight this ban. So this fight was a political and scientific one on the whale census along the north coast of Alaska. And I don't know if you can see that well, but that's a bowhead whale there. So the census started with just visual accounts of migrating bowheads from sites on cliffs and pressure ridges in the shore-fast ice along the open lead through which the whales, bowhead whales migrated. And they came up with this 2,000 to 3,000 count. So the subsistence hunters felt that the count was not accurate because it was based on assumptions that the migrating bowheads passed within sight of the certain census locations, and when the lead was closed, that they just stopped migrating altogether. It's like, ice is there, we're not going to migrate anymore. So subsistence hunters travel on the ice, And when the lead is closed, they go by boat to the pack ice and reported seeing whales from there. And as a result, between the whalers and their findings and collaborative situations similar to collaborative fieldwork and workshops, the census was expanded to include other components such as acoustic and aerial. And the acoustics helped detect migrating bowheads when the lead was closed, as whales were found to breathe through cracks on the pack ice or force their blowholes through thinner ice, which is what the subsistence hunters reported. And by flying transect perpendicular to the shore and beyond the visual range of the surface of the chosen location, the aerial component showed that bowheads do in fact migrate on a broader scale near the near shore lead. So again, indigenous knowledge has enabled the indigenous peoples of the Arctic to have a different way of knowing than Western science. And we're able to successfully come together and get this actually published to their advantage. And scientists looking into this particular incident were able to say, you know, maybe we better start listening to indigenous peoples and their knowledge. And that's how Aloka was formed, not based out of this particular case study. But it just shows an example of how science, Western science, needs to think outside their little box, or big box, whatever you want to call it, and consider other ways of knowing. Because indigenous knowledge, you can call it indigenous science, but I have been directed by indigenous peoples in the Arctic not to call it that. It is indigenous knowledge because it is all interconnected. The relationship is completely different than what you guys are learning about science. I can't find the right words except to say that, like you, it's an experience you learn and live if you grow up within those cultural contexts. Sorry. I'm sorry, David. So we're almost done here. Here we have just a small list of best practices. We do have some printouts of others up here for you to take if you wish. And these are just a few. I just chose some of them because they sounded good at the time I was choosing them. Because as a scientist myself, when doing or conducting or collaborating or partnering, the first place, because we're all under economic restrictions within our certain grants and stuff, I always like to look for free things because free is good. And so I start here within the university and look around, think around in my head, hey, maybe I can partner with Susan at Ceres, or maybe I can use David's services, which I have, as a photographer, and start doing that. Sorry. Communities, this is important again when working with indigenous communities, and I know some of you won't, but you may want to keep this in the back of your mind that they should be agents of their own change. Communication for social change should be empowering, horizontal versus the top down, give a voice to previously unheard members of the community, and be biased towards local content and ownership. Sorry. Allow local, especially Native communities, to help define problems of research or problems or research objectives because they understand their environments. I know as an outsider, I don't understand their environment. So I would look to them, just like I look here to the research community at CU. And then just when you're writing grants, utilizing Indigenous peoples for their labor and their knowledge, because they know their environments. I don't. I would tell you that if I was to go out on the ice, I would want to go out with my friend who's a whaling captain in Barrow. I wouldn't want to hire somebody who read something like this in a book. Down here in the South, they know the sounds of the ice. They know when it's going to shift and stuff because they're so in tune with their environment. We're down to our last slide. Is that okay?
We have other ones.
Oh, do we? Okay.
Yeah, let's skip this part.
Okay. So we have a list of resources that we kind of came up with, and as you can see, a lot of them, because I worked on this, tend to gear towards what I do research in. But I found that a lot of these resources can be geared towards any type of research that you're doing. Doesn't have to be an Indigenous community. It can be a local community here in Boulder, or in Mexico or India, or wherever you're going to do your research. This can all be applied.
Let's see, so we're trying to see how much we can get through with just a little bit of time when this conversation could obviously, hopefully, take multiple days. I think I'm going to go back to a case study, but I also want to say that one of the things in here that is most unconventional is the Build 2020 audio. It's an album that a friend of mine made that went and got a law degree, actually, and then decided that he wasn't a lawyer and he couldn't do it. He was a poet and an MC. And so he actually took a year to do with some of his learning in law school. He took a year to study technology from the side of business and technology. Where do business and scientists and technology leaders want to take technology in the next few years? And then he paired that with the history of social justice in the United States. I always tell people they should not listen to this album by themselves. You should get a little listening party and listen to it with a few other people. But it's kind of looking more future, and I think that, you know, we have some of our case studies and whatnot that we want to share with you all are kind of about the past, and that resource helps you start looking at the future. If you look at the history of social justice in the country and you pair it with technological and scientific prowess, what might that equal? And how might we need to pay attention to that in different ways than we're entrained to generally? Trying to think if this is the one that I want to go with so little time. We had wanted to create a context for why some communities are hesitant to work with scientists, and the examples that we have are Native, but it's not limited to just Native. And actually, if we were to give you a presentation of just case studies where things have gone awry between communities and science, it would probably be a traumatic experience for all of us in this room. Everything from forced sterilization to rationalization of enslavement and racial superiority, to spirit scientific experimentation on different peoples of color. So I won't name all of that, but it kind of needs to be named if you want to go and do work in communities and know why there's this hesitation. And actually, I wonder, even in this room, I've had a lot of really strange experiences with doctors. Has there been anyone in this room that has had an experience with a doctor that does not fit those goals that we were talking about, or just the betterment of humanity? Yeah, okay. So one example that we'd wanted to give was the story of Kennewick Man. Have any of you heard of him? Oh, good. Okay, good. So it was this nearly complete skeleton and skull that was found on the Umatilla Nation in Washington. And it was sent to the coroner, and the coroner determined the bones are ancient, at least 9,000 years old. And in order to comply with the law, which now says, as of like 1990, National American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act actually says you have to return the remains of Native people to their people. But there was a local archaeologist, James Chatters, who said, wait, before you give it back, I just want to look at it. And a few weeks later, he called a press conference, just of his own accord, called a press conference and proclaimed that the remains were Caucasoid and that they were European, which for people who've studied anthropology, biological anthropology, archaeology, that isn't possible. You actually can't look at human remains and know what race they are. So to scientists' defense, the Archaeological Institute of America did dismiss the claims. They said, this is not scientific, this can't be. But it really grabbed hold of the nation's imagination. And once this guy did this press conference, everybody started covering this. Discover, New Yorker, National Geographic. One of the headlines that we took was Europeans invade America at 20,000 BC. And we put this little part in the bottom because actually they're doing a ceremony for him and just being returned now in May. So next month will be the ceremony for his return to the Umatilla Nation. But it started to just get really crazy, and it sort of goes to those little things that we were saying of how all these things are intertwined of, was this about science, or was it actually about politics? Was racism involved? Chatters went on 60 Minutes and basically said that the tribes were against further testing because they feared that it would show that this human had been European, and that for some reason for him that meant that everything they've claimed had been false and that this was actually European land. And this great archaeologist Silverberg wrote about how come this took hold in this imagination. And white nationalist groups took this guy up, Kennewick Man, and was just like, this is our guy, this is our kin, we're being kept from our kin, people are trying to obscure the truth that we were here first. Okay, so this archaeologist said he was really looking at, why is this catching the imagination of Americans so much? He said, the dream of a prehistoric race in the American heartland was profoundly satisfying. Anything but Indians. And he sort of listed, it could have been ancient Jews and Vikings and, they almost didn't care who else it was. Anybody but Indians. And his sort of hypothesis was, it would be anything that would provide evidence around reminding Anglo settlers' descendants that the continent was stolen and that genocide had been committed here. And so that fear of wanting to face might come up with every single time these bones are found. You have these situations where scientists often don't give the bones back to the communities, and then they become this big political debate about who was here first, when scientific community doesn't actually have that question very much. And for me, it's like, even if there was one skeletal remain, no one has ever said no one wasn't here before. We know that the Chinese had tried to come. We know that there was some connection with Africa. We know that the Vikings had tried to come. So it's just this whole thing of like, why did this do this? And how could it be that even National Geographic and Discover, which for me is hard because I'm an armchair scientist, so I don't really consider myself a scientist, but I'm really interested in it. So I do read things like that, and I do read things like Discover and Scientific American and whatnot. And so this is hard for me to hear because I don't want to find out that I'm reading stuff that is much more contested and political than we want to admit.